Good morning, everybody, and welcome to ODI. I'm sorry we're running a bit late. I did promise Jeff I wouldn't mention this, but we've spent the past few minutes trying to track down Jeff's mobile.
Found it.
And it turns out Jeff is brilliant on a whole range of global poverty issues, but not so good at managing his phone, as it turns out. But there we are.
They're related.
So let me start by welcoming you to what is the launch of a new ODI Global Challenges series of lectures. And the aim is really to mark 2015 as a really critical year for international development. The series will bring together some of the world's top thinkers from academia and policy and the business community to discuss with a wider audience some of the big issues that are on the agenda for 2015. Today's event will focus on the role of international public finance in development. And of course, we know that one of the great challenges for the Addis Financing for Development Summit in July is to unlock the huge potential of private capital as a force for change in areas like infrastructure, the provision of energy, and many other areas. But it's important also to remember the vital role of international public finance. One of the great challenges that we face in 2015 is to put in place the mechanisms that will address what are the key development challenges of our time. And those challenges include extending opportunity to the world's most marginalized people and the most disadvantaged countries. And of course, international public finance has a vital role to play in addressing that challenge. I want to welcome also, we have over 400 online viewers today, which I think breaks a record. It may be related to your presence, actually, Jeff, who knows. But welcome to all of you who are joining online. If you want to join the conversation on Twitter, the hashtag is Global Challenges, using our handle at ODIDev, D-E-V. Let me say something before I introduce Jeff about the running order today. The first hour of this meeting will be dedicated to a presentation from Jeff and questions and answers. We'll then have a coffee break at 10:30. I was actually with Jeff yesterday at a private sector meeting, and they had an extraordinary spread during the coffee break. You probably missed it, but they had these wonderful cakes and scones, and you're going to get nothing like that here. But there will be biscuits and coffee in plentiful supply. And then after that session, we'll have three panelists who will join Jeff to explore in more detail some of the issues. Before I give the floor to Jeff, and I think Jeff really doesn't need an awful lot of introduction, but he is director of the Earth Institute at Columbia University. He's co-author of a report which is going into the Addis financing discussion. He's an advisor to the UN Secretary General. He's also a prolific journalist and a prolific author. And I think his book, Commonwealth Economics for a Crowded Planet, was really one of those books that did more than anything to bring together the poverty agenda and the sustainability agenda, which is right at the heart of what we're trying to achieve in 2015. I was actually asking Kofi Annan yesterday, if you're introducing Jeff, what would you say? And he sort of shrugged a bit and he said, well, Jeff's basically a force of nature. So I think that's leave it at that. But I did want to say one thing, which I think you could say many things about Jeff and his fantastic publications record in many areas. But he's really someone who has dedicated his formidable and I think unique intellectual advocacy and communications capabilities to some of the defining challenges and issues of our day, in particular fighting global poverty. So Jeff, welcome to ODI. Thank you, and over to you.
Kevin, thank you very much, and what a pleasure to be here with you and with your great leadership, Kevin, on all of these issues that are the favorites of ours together, and with many, many friends in the room and online, I hope and expect as well. So It's a great opportunity at the beginning of this year to be in the right place to discuss these issues with key thought leaders in the global development effort. This is the year of sustainable development. If we miss it, we've really lost an opportunity that comes around once in a generation. And given the difficulties that we face in the world, we can't afford to wait another generation, because we've basically spent the last 2 generations since the Stockholm Summit on Environment and Development in 1972 not acting on this dual agenda of development and environment. And we're up against the wall now. 2015 really is our chance in this generation to get this right, and it's the last chance quantitatively to avoid fundamental mishaps for humanity. If it's a 2035 conference on sustainable development as the make or break, we've already broken the intergenerational pledge and the safety of the planet. And I can assure you, having been in this process for a long time now, more than almost 2 generations myself, you don't get chances like 2015. You can't make them happen. It happens by dint of the calendar that various waves of different frequency have all come together this year, so that the climate negotiations, the 70th anniversary of the United Nations, the end of the Millennium Development Goals, the adoption of the agenda from the 20th anniversary of the Rio Summit, all have fallen on this year. And we're going to have a 6-month period from July through December to reorient the direction of the world economy. Now, I can assure you the world economy doesn't want reorientation and isn't aware that it needs any reorientation. Global capitalism is a juggernaut. It's an enormously impressive juggernaut. It has been an enormously impressive juggernaut for 2 centuries. If you want to read the highest panegyrics of praise of the dynamism of global capitalism, there's no better place than the Communist Manifesto in 1848 to read about the uniqueness of this system, which will break down all walls around the world to create a global economy in its image, as a couple of relatively well-known authors once said. And that's true. And we now have a $100 trillion world economy. It is enormously productive. The share of the world living in extreme poverty is at the lowest point in history. Probably around 16% of the world living under the World Bank's definition of 16% of the developing world living below the World Bank's poverty line. We don't know, because the World Bank is characteristically 4 years late in providing data. Google could probably tell us what the poverty rate is this morning if we asked. But in any event, this is a juggernaut. Juggernauts move forward something akin to Newton's first law, and which is that they will continue in motion in a given direction, except if a force is applied with enough force to be proportionate to the mass and the needed acceleration. And we absolutely need to apply a force to shift the direction of the economy, not to undo the dynamism, not to stop the development, not to doubt the development, by the way, because despite the 2008 crisis, the world economy is still growing at 3 to 4% per year, despite the slowdown of China, which is a slowdown that is part and parcel of China's success of raising income levels. It's not a sign of catastrophe, it's a sign of success. the world economy is growing at more than 3% per year. And if we're not dumb, that's a big if, it will continue to do so. So that's good. Economic development is actually within reach. People like Larry Summers, who say we're in an age of secular stagnation, should get out of their office once in a while and actually go to developing countries and see what it's like. This is not an age of stagnation. This is an age of rapid development, actually. And people who worry that we've run out of technological advancement, like Robert Gordon, should really understand that IT is more than posting your Facebook page, whatever you feel about that, and nothing against that. It's a very deep transformative force for delivering health, for delivering education, for delivering infrastructure, for business development, for financial access. So we're living actually in a time of tremendous dynamism and tremendous potential. But the world economy is not on a sustainable development trajectory. And that is a huge, huge danger for the world. So our question is how to keep the dynamism. And I think that, although, God, I hate to say it because it'll be misinterpreted a million times, but I'm going to say it anyway because that's how I've lived my life. Global capitalism's a good idea, is what I'm going to say, because actually it can deliver the things we want. It can deliver the end of poverty. It can deliver broad prosperity. It can deliver environmental sustainability. But it's not doing that right now. And 2015 is crucial for getting this right. So why isn't it delivering these things? I think that there are some fundamental points that need to be acknowledged, and that's what the Sustainable Development Goals need to address. First, it is leaving still the hard pockets of poverty behind. And while there has been improvement in the conditions of the poorest of the poor over the last 15 years in many places, not enough, not fast enough, and not even remotely close to what we could have achieved had we put our minds to it. Wherever we have invested in making progress, we've had breakthroughs. We talked yesterday about malaria and AIDS, where there was not one person on AIDS treatment in the year 2000 in the world on a donor-funded program. And now there are well over 10 million. The one count is 13 million on donor-supported AIDS treatment. That's just one example. There are countless examples. When you invest, you get it right. But we're leaving a lot of people behind right now. It's absurd. It's a tragedy. It's an anachronism to have extreme poverty in the 21st century. We're a $100 trillion world economy. The average output per person is $13,000 at international prices. And yet we have people that are struggling to stay alive day by day. This is completely wrong-headed, and it's a nonsense from an organizational and an ethical and a geopolitical and an economic point of view. So that's number one, why we're not on a sustainable development course, because we have not made basic breakthroughs that we can make. Second reason is that the world population continues to grow too rapidly, and especially in the poorest countries and especially in Africa. And this is a threat on many fronts. First, to ending extreme poverty itself in these places with rapid population growth. They're under tremendous ecological stress, economic stress, financial stress, social stress. And yet Africa's population is on a path by UN estimates to quadruple this century. No thank you. Fertility rates above 5, which is Africa's average right now, around 5.2 total fertility rate, is incompatible with sustainable development. And we need a rapid, voluntary reduction of fertility rates. Fortunately, we know just how that comes about. Keep girls in school, enable them to finish secondary school, ensure access to family planning services, to universal health coverage, and you'll have a demographic transition on a voluntary basis like we need. So that's a second sense. A third sense that is quite complicated is that there are indeed pressures within the world economy from globalization and technological change for widening income inequalities and a dramatic disruption of labor markets. It's really true that artificial intelligence, robotics, the information revolution is changing the labor markets in fundamental ways. So there are pressures for widening income inequalities that are real and are poorly elucidated right now. Because unfortunately, a lot of academic study only works when you have a long enough time series to look backward, because it's not so good at looking forward. If you look forward, it may be good, but all your colleagues say, prove it, and you can't run a regression to prove it necessarily. And so we're not so good at new trends or breaks in the history as we are in looking backward. And this is a break, but we don't know it yet. And the papers and the analyses have not been done yet. Now, then there are two kinds of political systems. There are the kind that Ambassador Geir Peterson, who is sitting in the front row, represents, Scandinavian social democracy, which says if you have widening income inequalities, you lean against that to try to ensure that all of society moves ahead together. And then there's the political system I live in, the United States, which says if you have widening income inequalities, great! We can even get richer if we give ourselves tax breaks, make this contribution, spend $1 billion by the Koch brothers to give further tax cuts and so forth. And so you amplify the inequalities rather than narrowing them. So part of the process is first to recognize the underlying dynamics, which come from markets and technology, and then to understand the political filter through which these pressures are transmitted into net outcomes in the end. Piketty is right about the widening inequality, but he's wrong to think that it's a law of markets. Just look at Scandinavia. It's no law of markets. It's about politics and it's about choices. Then the fourth reason that we are not on a sustainable development trajectory is, of course, the environmental crisis. We've been warned about this for a long time. I took my first economics class 43 years ago. Okay? Swallow that. And the first book that I was assigned in freshman Ec 10, we called it at Harvard College, Economics 10, was actually in the fall of 1972, Limits to Growth. And I read that, and then my professor said, well, we're assigning this because this is an example of bad research. Look at this model. There are no prices in it. You know, how can you say something about the world economy that there will be shortages? Don't they know that if there are shortages of this resource or that resource, the price will rise and that will cause a shift? And don't worry so much, we were told. And then we were told there was this old guy named Thomas Robert Malthus who said silly things back in 1798 about population, but we've also proved that that's not the right way to think about the problem. So that's how I was trained back in 1972. The endless horizons, the absence of limits to growth, and a rather blithe sense that all comes out right in the end. Now, we should understand it's nothing like that. Things could come out right, but they don't necessarily come out right. What I was told back in 1972, that prices will make sure that things come out right, has a little bit of logic to it. It's one of the some points of wisdom of economics that one could call Smith-Pigou economics. Smith said that markets would give prices. Pigou said sometimes you have to correct the prices to make them send the right signals. And nobody has put the price on CO2 yet, for example, in an adequate way to send the right signal that we're on a path of self-destruction through CO2 emissions. So limits to growth turned out to be spot on the CO2 emissions forecasts and on the risks of overshooting, which was the basic message back in 1972. And the basic message was geometric growth relative to a finite planet, if unattended to, can lead to overshooting and disaster. That's a really smart message. That was a darn good book. I asked my students this year, who's heard of this? None of the students had even heard of the book. For us, it was a pivotal moment in intellectual thought that came along with the UN conference in Stockholm. And it was formative for me in this odd way, but I am recovering from my ECTEN education every day. It's taken 43 years to learn to round out the picture a little bit, but it's a very important piece. So we have geometric growth against a finite planet. And some people say, well, that's an intrinsic, illogical idea, that it's an impossibility. I think that that is an extreme view in an important sense. Others say there's no problem because if you actually study most modern economics, there are no finite factors in the mathematical equations because they really mess up things. So you don't even learn about limits to growth because even in the basic growth model, there are no limits because there's no physical reality in those models. And so you can be so well trained that you don't even see the obvious. Or there's a middle ground, which I believe is right, which is that growth through ingenuity is real, but you have to attend to the real limits and risks that you face. And that means directing technological change partly through prices, partly through corrective prices, and partly through other instruments such as directed, public-supported technological advancement in key areas such as renewable energy to get this right so that we can have growth but respect the planetary boundaries that have their finite limits. So those four items, I believe, the entrenched poverty, which is very serious, where I was 2 weeks ago in the Sahel, or in Ethiopia, where I was last week, we need to address that as a real phenomenon. And we need to address the population issue because we're now 7.3 billion people on the way to 9 billion by 2040. And potentially 10, 11 billion. This is no good for quality of life, especially for the poorest of the poor. And thank goodness that Pope Francis opened up a discussion about this himself last week when he said being a good Catholic doesn't mean you have to breed like rabbits, comma, excuse the expression, said the Pope. That was his expression. Well, he was making an important point, that there is a responsibility to be able to raise children in a way that they're healthy, with proper nutrition and proper education. And a poor family cannot do that with 5, 6, 7 children, and a poor society cannot do that if on average there are 4, 5, 6, 7 children per household. So that needs to be addressed. And the inequalities coming from technological change need to be addressed. And the environmental catastrophe that we're already in the midst of in this age of the Anthropocene needs to be addressed. That's the Sustainable Development Agenda. It's not exactly the Sustainable Development Goals because the SDGs haven't taken on population. It's so sensitive. Nobody wants to talk about it. except the Pope. It's interesting. And so I think that this is a very important time that we can face these issues. Now, just to conclude, to face these issues, we have to understand their analytical basis, their systems dynamics, and a basic point which keeps economists employed after all the other things they do wrong, which is that you need resources to solve problems. That is the most basic economic truth. Of course, then economists stumble badly by thinking resources only come through markets, whereas resources come through all forms of social interaction, including voluntarism, including social action, and including tax and transfer policies or government outlays. They're all part of resource allocation. And we do not get success without resources allocated to these problems. Now, let's be absolutely clear. We've got all the resources we need to solve these problems. And if you do the actual calculations about what resources are needed to ensure that every child can get at least a secondary education in the world, that everybody can have access to basic health services, that energy can be produced with a low-carbon energy system, and so forth, it is absolutely the case. You can't reach even 5% of GDP incremental costs to be able to ensure all those good things. The costs are absolutely manageable. Indeed, the joke of it is that about 1,645 people, if well chosen, could solve this. Now, of course, the well chosen is the list on the Forbes billionaire list. This past year, these 1,645 individuals had a combined net worth of $6.4 trillion. Okay, that's a good start. And if you were to put that as an endowment for sustainable development, that would, at least at Columbia University's rules, that would be a 5% payout. And that would be $320 billion a year annual flow. So if we could just get Bill and his friends together, Bill, Warren, and a few others, to Carlos and a few others together, they could do it by themselves, which would be a good project, actually. At least as interesting as making Facebook or new Microsoft Windows system or something. You could actually get the world onto a sustainable development path. And 320 billion would actually do it, because the rest would come through private flows. We need trillions. But the 320 billion of true high-quality ODA would actually get the job done to make sure that no one's left behind in this, and that climate financing could be done, and that the universal education could be accomplished, and so forth. So anytime people think this is beyond measurement, beyond possibility, beyond systems, beyond financial reach, just has not done the arithmetic, pure and simple. This is fundamentally a matter of will. This is not a matter of capacity. It's a matter of will. Now, what do you need for the will to do this? Basically, we need two things, and that's why I'm a believer in this year. One, we're learning a lot from neuroscience that the essence of consciousness is attention. We don't know exactly what human consciousness is, but we know that it's something like the ability of the brain to be attentive to its own brain state. You're conscious when you are attentive to your own brain state. Most of what happens we're not aware of because we're not attending to it. But consciousness seems to be related to attention. And I would say at a social level, the key is attention, to say this is important. And so the Sustainable Development Goals should be about attention. By the way, a committee output is not aimed at attention most of the time. So we have to take the 17 goals as they are and make them 12 attention-getting goals by restating them in a way that can get the world's attention. But that's the first part of the will to do something, is the attention. And the second part, I think, is the ethics. And that is that it's valuable to attend to these issues, that there is value in our lives to solving these problems. Not everybody believes that. There are sociopaths who believe the opposite. Sometimes they even come to power. But most people believe it. And that's why a social movement is key. Because what a social movement is, don't tell me about the accidents of the psychopaths and the sociopaths in power. Tell us about what people want. And that's what society needs to raise its voice. It's not about the preening of the politicians. That's their job, to preen. Our job is to turn off the TV enough, get out in the streets and say this is really important and we want this done. And to be very clear on the message that the world really wants to end poverty. It wants to address inequality. It wants to keep the climate safe and to preserve the biodiversity. Now, I'll just end with saying that London, by history, has been the center of such social movements. It was London also, I think, more than any other place that made the Millennium Development Goals real and dynamic. And you have 200 years of experience of social movements. In the United States, we can barely get started sometimes. But here you have 200 years. So use it. You've already used it to get every major party in power, every major party, I should say, behind the basic idea of 0.7 and this commitment and this kind of problem solving. And I would say that the dynamics here help to put the Millennium Development Goals not only onto the diplomatic agenda, but onto the world social agenda. And we need to do the same thing, and 2015 is the key year. Thanks a lot.
Jeff, that was great. Thank you. Before I throw it open to questions, or I ask them invited audience to give questions, I want to ask you one thing, which I guess is the most obvious question of all. And I know you're an optimist by nature, but when you look back to the MDG period, the end of the 90s, I mean, in retrospect, it sort of looks like a golden age for international cooperation. The goals were framed, we created the global funds and so on. If you look at where we are now, there is if you use the attention analogy, we have a global leadership with serious attention deficit disorders in this respect. And I wondered, what do you think really are the prospects for a breakthrough in Addis and some of the big summits?
I don't think 2015 intrinsically is any more difficult. I think, in fact, it's easier than 2000. I was involved heavily in the public health discussions from the late 90s to the early 2000s to create the Global Fund, for example. There was nothing obvious at the time. It was extraordinarily difficult even to get basic concepts in place. There was nothing obvious about the Jubilee movement, drop the debt, HIPC. None of that was guaranteed. We had two presidents that either, I don't know if it's literal or only figuratively attention deficit disorder, but between Clinton and Bush, George W. come on, that's really a problem. And believe me, if you don't think so about Clinton, I'll tell you sometime. They were not focused on this. And Bill Clinton was 8 years in power, and not one person was on AIDS treatment anywhere in the world. Not a single person. And aid fell to the lowest level in U.S. history under Bill Clinton. Because it wasn't that this was an age of global cooperation. This was the beginning planks of putting U.S. unilateralism in place. Even under Clinton's relatively benign view, this was the unipolar world. You didn't have to give aid anymore. We weren't competing with the Soviet Union. So the aid budget disappeared. That's, from the U.S. point of view, a strategic budget, not a humanitarian budget. And so it went down to almost nothing. George W. Bush actually raised the ODA budget significantly as a share of GNP. So there was nothing obvious about the year 2000 except it was a great calendar date. You know, it was wonderful. And we had a wonderful Secretary General, Kofi Annan, committed to that. We have a wonderful Secretary General today, Ban Ki-moon, committed to this agenda. But we have to open up the space, and we have to reach out, which is easier to do now than it was 15 years ago, to leaders in Africa and Asia, Latin America, to say this is real and this is important. This is not a Western agenda, could never be, must never be. And we need to hear China's leadership on this to be very absolutely clear about this, because China is either the number one or the number two economy in the world, depending on whose data you use. China is a vast power of global significance. It's also the most polluting country in the world by far. Not per person, but in the aggregate impacts on the world. So believe me, without China, there are no solutions in this. This is not China's timetable. If you think about Deng Xiaoping, one of the great leaders of modern history, his timetable was give China basically another 30 or 40 years before to finish its development trajectory, then it can play a larger global role. And this global role is being put on China faster, I think, than China wants, because China's got a lot of hugely difficult internal development dynamics left for another generation or two. And yet it has to play a highly constructive global role right now before it wants to, in a sense. Not that it doesn't want to, it wants to be cooperative and collaborative and constructing, but it doesn't want to do it just now because it's got too many internal problems. But it has to do it now also. So we have to reach out to the Chinese leadership, to the Indian leadership, to other major countries to say this is universal agenda. It really counts. It fits the value system in every part of the world. It's part of China's harmonious society ideas, and it is compatible with visions all over the world. But it's very hard to have that global conversation. Nothing is harder in 2015, though, than in 2000. It's just that don't look to the United States to solve this. That's all I'm telling you. The U.S. is one of many countries now. It's militarily the most powerful. It's got the biggest surveillance system in the world, but it's not the biggest player in solving these problems necessarily. We need full global cooperation.
Thank you, Jeff. I've got some invited questions. First from Joanna MacDonald from DFID.
Thanks very much for the opportunity to comment, and thanks to ODI for this really interesting series of events, and of course to Jeffrey Sachs for those really thought-provoking remarks. So we in DFID are looking forward to the opportunities offered by 2015, and we really hope that we can find those breakthroughs that you've clearly outlined the need for. I'm in the Finance for Development team, so we're focusing on Addis, and our focus at the moment is trying to develop an international offer to bring to the table at the Addis conference and in the preparatory negotiations. We do hope that Addis can open up and adopt a comprehensive approach to financing for sustainable development. I think it's really clear from what you've said that we can't afford to dismiss any possible sources of resources for development. So we're looking at public and private, domestic and international resources, and also really clear that the policy environment within which those resources are used is absolutely crucial for them to have the impact that they need to have. We see in that agenda that there are a lot of asks implicit on developing countries. So we would like them to be able to raise more resources domestically. We're asking them to attract greater private finance and so on. And therefore, we think it's really key that we develop, so that we're not just in asking mode, that we develop an international offer to bring to the table. And at the moment, we're working both within the UK across Whitehall to look at what the UK component of that offer ought to be, and also working with partners internationally to try to make sure that others are doing the same. I'll be really brief. So we see the two essential elements of that offer as ODA, which is completely fundamental to financing for sustainable development, and then secondly, a kind of policy package to support developing countries in doing the things that I've just mentioned. On ODA, we're working closely with EU partners to try to press for a European collective recommitment to ODA and to a new timetable. Sorry, okay. I'd be really interested in your views on how best to make the case for ODA. How do we win people over? We see it as absolutely critical and fundamental. You've mentioned the need for China's leadership. How do you think we can best get traction and win people over to the idea that ODA is essential and find the political momentum that's needed? And then secondly, on the policy measures, what do you think are the really key ones that we should be looking for in Addis? Thanks very much.
Jeff, what I want to do actually is just that we've got a couple more invited questions.
Great,
so from Linda McAvan. Sorry, Linda, where's... So Linda is chair of the MEP Development Committee.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, hi. I'm over here. Well, the European Commission should be publishing imminently the proposals for the whole of the European Union on the means of implementation on the 2015 package. So we're hoping to see a common EU policy going to those talks, just to comment on that. But I was interested in what you said about this unique opportunity in 2015. In the European Union, it's been designated European Year for Development, which means all the countries are supposed to be working together, and this is part of the agenda to get things going. But it's interesting for me because before I was chair of the committee, only from this year, only since July, I worked on climate change policies very heavily, on environment policy, and yet we didn't talk about the SDG agenda in that field of work. And in fact, I wonder how I think you're right, we need a social movement. We need something like the Make Poverty History. But I'm a politician, and I'm not getting that in my inbox. I'm not getting people banging at my door, talking about the UN General Assembly in 2015, talking about the importance. So I wondered, how are we going to, we're all here, we have to do that. That's not happening at the minute. My colleagues, in fact, don't know. And secondly, how are we going to link the two, the Addis, New York, and Paris, the climate talks? How are those things working, do you think?
Thank you.
And will the US actually come on board?
Wonderful.
Thanks. Mark Goldring, who's head of Oxfam. Mark? Okay. Yeah. Oxfam is an organisation that's very good at getting people sending stuff to inboxes of politicians. So
we'll get a mail sent out today. Jeff, could you tell us a little bit more on the financing side, particularly about international taxation?
Yeah.
You picked on your 1,600 people. Bill Gates responded to that by saying, I give away a lot of my wealth, but probably 1,500 of them don't. Right. So we've got the issue of domestic taxation, but domestic taxation without progress on the international side is always going to be limited. Where do you see the momentum and the possibilities there?
Wonderful.
Thank you. And the last vice question, Alex Evans. Alex, so there we go. Alex is a NYU Centre on International Cooperation.
Yeah.
I think
Thanks,
based
Kevin.
in Addis Ababa
Hi,
right
Jack.
now.
Hey, how are you?
If you imagine a kind of a feasible best case outcome from the Addis summit, the question I'd be interested in hearing from you about is, what would you imagine to be the story that leads the following day's newspapers? And what do you think the summit will be remembered for with 5 or 10 years hindsight? So if we're looking back at Monterey, the story in the next day's papers would, I guess, have been PEPFAR. And with 5 or 10 years hindsight, we'd have been thinking, well, it really underpinned HIPC and a rise in ODA. So what's the equivalent this time around in a best case scenario?
Excellent.
Great. Jeff, could I ask maybe if you could give relatively brief response to that? I know there's an awful lot there, and that's difficult to do, but I do want to try and take one round from the wider audience as well.
Should we just continue with
Shall we do that?
Okay, yeah, and then I'll give a,
Let's do that. Forrest, hands going up. We'll start over here.
Rob Yates from Chatham House. Jeff, you sort of mentioned the importance of political commitment, and I think this is absolutely essential. I mean, it's all about sort of political will. How well do you think the current sustainable development goals are going to be good for inspiring political commitment? Because a lot of them read as sort of a bit wishy-washy and nebulous. Dare I say it's even a bit hippy-dippy, but certainly that's the case with the health one. So what do you think can be done to sort of really tighten them up and make them look attractive to political leaders?
Thanks, Rob. There's one right behind you while the mic's over there, actually.
Thank you. Jonathan Glennie from Save the Children. I buy your call for a lot more international public finance, but my question is, do you think there are issues about very low-income countries receiving a lot more international money? Basically, the question of flooding their economies. Yeah. Is that a problem for you? The way that I get around that is by saying, yes, we need a lot more international public finance, but it should also go to some of the big middle-income countries to support infrastructure, climate finance and all that. But in your paper, you make it quite clear that it should be very much focused on LICs. What I'm worried about is then, the political implications of that.
Okay.
Thanks, Jonathan. One right here, behind you, James, actually, first. So I'm working my way across the room.
It's Steve Podmore of Transform Global. Jeff, you said a couple of things that I think are really critically important. You said we need resources to solve problems, and you said we have to get attention. The likes of the Koch brothers and other special interests have a lot of resources, and they spend them on very effective communication to divert attention and to confuse. So my question is, how important is the effective and corralled resources for creating a better narrative and being relentless in how that better narrative is selling what's positive rather than the opposite?
Okay, I'm going to take one last quick one from James. Sorry, you only say who you are. I've just said who you are.
All right, James Cameron, Chairman of ODI. I'm interested in the connection between domestic finance and mixture of public and private finance for big transformations like access to energy.
Yeah.
And we're getting some good signals from major economies like India that the solar revolution is an access to energy. It's just as much to do with fairness and justice as it is to do with renewables and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Could you just make some observation on how we move that agenda forward, maybe specifically what kind of instruments might blend the forms of capital for that energy transformation, not least in Africa?
Okay. I'm afraid I'm going to have to cut this round of questions. We are going to have Jeff part of the next session, so there will be an opportunity to continue this discussion. But Jeff, there's a hell of a lot to cover there, but it may be just give us an initial response.
So I'll try to organize and I hope I touch on almost everybody's, and then I'll come back, but focus on the Finance for Development conference. What could be achieved? What are the highlights as I would like to see them? First, this has to be a conference about both public financing and private financing and their blend for sustainable development. So this is both about mobilizing official or public finance and about transforming the financial system in a way that addresses these issues more effectively, the private sector financial system. Both of those are on the agenda. And we know that we need both public and private investment to solve these problems for several reasons. First, when it comes to very poor people, markets will not pay attention, at least if they're smart, because they won't get paid. So the reason for financing is to help poor people get out of the trap of their poverty, to meet their basic needs, ensure their human dignity, and escape from poverty. That's the idea of ODA fundamentally. And we need public financing also because a lot of what needs to be invested in, if it's large infrastructure, for example, is at least partly public goods in character. It's either natural monopoly, or it's network externalities, or it has other non-rivalness features that mean that it cannot be efficiently provided by the by the private sector. And you just have to go back to a wonderful book in 1776, book 5 of The Wealth of Nations, to read about public works and why they need to be supported by government. So this is an old story. We need in FFD both of these things, because we're aiming for trillions of dollars of financing for infrastructure, and we're aiming for hundreds of billions of dollars of financing for social services and basic needs. And both of those need to be well reflected and also blended, because these are always complex mixed institutions with targeted delivery purposes. And this is the biggest weakness of academic economics, which is it does not teach the institutional richness of how you actually move resources to address human needs. That's fundamental part of what economics is about. But who learns that? That's complicated mess. It's not, and it's not taught. And so this is the real business that we're in, is designing institutions that can move resources to solutions, whether it's public or private resources, whether it's through taxes, donations, philanthropy, or profit-oriented activity, and to understand when different parts of that system work and how they work. You cannot ask a business to be a philanthropy, basically. It's not in their blood, but you can first steer, direct, identify the wider responsibilities, stop the bad stuff through Pigouvian corrective pricing, and mobilize public financing where private financing does not sit. This is basic public economics, but it is not in the bloodstream of how we teach or the rhetoric of our political systems, actually. Of most political systems. Now, what does that mean in practice? First, ODA, we need it. We need to keep mobilizing it. We need a wider set of actors for it. We need to bring China into the multilateral aid system. China's a wonderful donor. It's building a lot of incredibly valuable things across Africa right now. It's building power plants and roads and infrastructure. I want China to be part of a multilateral system. So we need to expand the number of donor countries. There are a lot of high-income donor countries that are not DAC members. We need a wider forum beyond the OECD, a global forum for development finance. And that could take many forms, but it should include a much wider range of actors than the DAC. And this is one part of it. Making sure that 0.7 applies not to just the DAC list, but the whole high-income list. We would propose bringing the upper middle income countries formally into the multilateral aid process by saying have a goal of 0.1% of GNI. It's not just the high income countries, it's also upper middle. In this world, if you're an upper middle income country, you're in good luck compared to being in a lower middle income or a poor country. So do something for the rest of the world to help make this process of sustainable development work. Let's go to Bill Gates, literally, and say with the Giving Pledge, make the Giving Pledge part of the sustainable development agenda. Let's get the Giving Pledge not just to be give half your wealth to someplace for good causes, but for the world's causes. Because that's actually a lot of money. And Bill Gates single-handedly, or with four hands, because Melinda's there together with him, have made a huge difference in public health. But where are the rest? Let's get them involved. And let's really go talk to them now, day by day. Carlos Slim, save global education. Why not? And there are 1,645 doors to knock on. Bill Gates can help. He has all the email addresses. knows a lot of them. He and Warren could really accelerate our process, but they should be contributing, and that's not small money. That's not small money, that's large money. And it's good, and there are a lot of people that would like to do things that don't know what to do, how to do it, what the partnership is, even what we're talking about here today. And so I think we need to reach out and really help that process as well. Then we need the private sector part of this to be serious. This is part of the offer. How, and here's my general claim. Take a map of Africa right now and put on the fiber, the highways, the rail network, the ports. Look at that and then fill in the lines of what a sustainable African economy, middle-income continent would look like. It would have a lot more connection than it has right now. And then ask the question, how can this be financed over the next 20 years? And the answer is most of that is private financing or public borrowing for infrastructure, but with a fiscal plan ahead through public sector tariffs or blended finance. What we can't do is leave hundreds of millions of people without electricity any longer. First theorem of development, there is no development without electricity. Impossible. Second theorem is PV has come down so much in cost, everybody can have electricity. Third theorem is the world's best solar energy by far is the Sahel. The poorest place in the world. I call it the revenge of the desert. Maybe someday all our energy will come from the poor drylands today. But we should be thinking of that map and saying, and NEPAD has helped make that map, we will finance this map over the next 20 years. We being the international capital markets in this case, with the blended finance, with the new institutions, with the public sector institutions, with the green banks and the national development banks and the development finance institutions and the MDBs. These are special agencies that understand both finance and development issues. They're great. We need them right now. They need to tap large-scale capital and transform it into a generation of infrastructure building. By the way, it's good business. I love a recent agreement, for example, that Denmark is putting, as a country, indeed, you could say, through the Danish Climate Fund, putting a 375 megawatt wind power project in northern Kenya. It's Vestas, it's Danida, it's the Danish budget, it's a Denmark pension. So it's public-private in the best way with a specialized development institution, the Danish Climate Investment Fund, for a really good project. It's good for the country, it's good for its exports, it's good for its leading technology, it's good for environment and so forth. It means we have to rethink, by the way, this tied aid principle, which was a bad principle. By completely untying aid, we also untied the political support for aid. Because our companies should sell good products to these countries, and that should be financed as well. So we need a very creative way to move a lot of funding for large-scale infrastructure. And it is really true. Every child should have health and education, and every household should have electricity. That's really important. And it can be done. It's absolutely within technological reach. So we should come out of the FFD with that part as well. Then the last part is, as Ted Turner says, he's one of our great supporters, of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. He says, solving the world's problems is easy. Do the good things and stop doing the bad things. And this is really good advice from a really, really, really good businessman and philanthropist. And the bad things we're doing are we're financing large new hydrocarbon projects up until recently. The fall of oil prices has been wonderful from the point of view of stopping Arctic drilling, rethinking the oil sands projects in Canada, and so forth, maybe even torpedoing Keystone if these prices could stay down long enough. We need for that not to come back. And Ambassador, you know I love Norway completely. It's one of the greatest places and most wonderful societies, but I actually don't want Statoil drilling in the Arctic because we don't need that oil. We need your hydroelectric power, not the hydrocarbons, not the new high-cost Arctic hydrocarbons. And so this is also part of what we need to come out of FFD, which is stop doing the bad stuff. That means disclosure rules. It means responsible investing. It means that we get stock markets signed up on principles of looking at climate risk, stranded asset risk, and so forth. And this, I think, is also illicit flows, which has been such a wonderful campaign of Oxfam. Also, Oxfam is superlative in every way in its advocacy always, but these past few months just burning it up in the inequality agenda, the illicit flows agenda, the Robin Hood tax. All of that is should be part of this agenda, and it's really time for this. Now, on the social movement, my one recommendation of social movement, of course, I'm completely biased in this, but I believe we can make a social movement around sustainable development. It is the right concept because it means a holistic approach to society that balances economic, social, and environmental objectives. It's both an analytical approach and a normative approach. And it is the concept we want to convey. That's why I love the fact that these goals will be sustainable development goals, because every school child around the world, and I want that to mean every child around the world, will learn sustainable development as an idea, as a shared value of a more holistic approach to our lives, which will be better lives, and which have a shared vision that encompasses every major religious tradition and every major social tradition around the world. So it's a concept that the world can agree on and then relate back to its own cultural values or iconic values. And this is what I think we need to explain to people clearly, that this is a concept that works for you. It fits within a moral framework, and it can make the world better and safer just at the time that it needs to do that. And that, to my mind, is the social movement.
Okay, Jeff, what do I say? It's not every day in ODI we have an inspirational call for action backed by a practical strategy, actually. And I think that all of us need to
Could I
learn.
say one more thing to Steve's question?
Sure.
Steve said one thing that is absolutely crucial for us, also for the social movement, so I just wanted to refer to it. The Koch brothers, we don't know how much money they put into the 2014 election, but a credible estimate that I've heard is about $450 million. And that fits with the rhetoric of last week when they said we're going to, quote, double our effort to around 900 million in 2016. This is two guys, by the way. They happen to own the world's largest privately owned oil company, and they're two of the most polluting, two of the most responsible people in the world for our crisis, especially because they finance buying the Senate to stop sensible projects. Now, the estimate is that their network put on about 44,000 political advertisements in the 2014 election. This is real stuff. It's no joke, especially in the way the U.S. political system works, where people may or may not vote. It is getting votes out, not necessarily changing minds, but getting people out to vote. And it's that margin, the base, that makes the difference. I don't want us to rely on two people giving this, especially in this non-transparent way. But I do think using the social media, which is what social movements are good at, there's a lot of free stuff available. And we need to use that massively. And I like it that way. I want to see campaigns in the future in the US. We're not going to beat the money with money. We're only going to beat the money with no money, actually. By saying we take no money, we run for free. They're the ones that are on the take and win the elections that way. So it's got to be the jujitsu approach of doing it. But for the social movement, the communications message is key. We've got to win on every aspect of social media.
Thanks, Jeff. What I was going to say was that it was a really inspirational call to action, and with a strategy behind it. And actually, my appeal to everyone in this audience, that we've got great researchers here, we've got people who are engaged politically, we've got aid agencies, we've got the business community, and we've got great organisations like Oxfam and SAVE. And I think the big challenge is for all of us to come together to be part of this movement and to think really strategically about how we work together to achieve change. So it was an inspirational call to action, a practical strategy, with great references to Adam Smith, Pigou, Marx and Engels. It's not every day we get this over here, so you thank you, Jeff, for that. And I know you've got a quick meeting now, but we'll be seeing you after.
Absolutely.
For the rest of you, there is coffee, biscuits, and refreshments outside. Could I ask? I'm getting desperate messages from the back here. I know it says 15 minutes break. It's actually 5 minutes, and that's a rapid turnaround time. So move quickly now. Get the coffee and then come back. Thank you.